Good evening. Hi, I'm Jocelyn Wong, the Director of Community Engagement here at the Nantucket Historical Association. Welcome to our lecture series here at the Whaling Museum. Tonight we will hear from Jamie Jones, Assistant Professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She will discuss the contents of her recently published book on the ramifications of energy transition on Nantucket and how the island achieved its quaintness. Some of the material for her book was gathered during a pivotal research trip to the NHA archives. Nantucket is famous for its quaintness: salt gray shingled houses, cobblestone streets, antique lighthouses, and even the old candle factory that became the Whaling Museum. It might seem like Nantucket has always been quaint, but Nantucket quaintness has a distinct and surprising history. In this talk, Jamie Jones will explain how Nantucketers and the first waves of summer visitors made the island quaint as a response to the massive energy transitions of the 19th century. Professor Jamie Jones earned her PhD in American Studies at Harvard University, and her research explores the energy transitions of the 19th century when whale oil and other organic energy sources gave way to fossil fuels. She considers the way that US literature, art, and popular culture represented that energy transition. Those cultural representations, in turn, have shaped environmental change, our practices of energy extraction and consumption, and our imagination of the world's oceans. Her book, Rendered Obsolete: Energy Culture and the Afterlife of US Whaling, is a product of her research and is available for purchase tonight over there. You're welcome to help yourself to a book and get it signed by the author this evening. So without further ado, please welcome Jamie Jones.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for that amazing introduction. And I want to begin with thanks. Thank you so much for inviting me back to the island to give this talk. I owe huge thanks to Jocelyn Wong, to Annalie Gilbert-Keith, to Adam Delegue for arranging this visit, for getting me set up with all the tech, to getting me to the island. I also want to thank the amazing staff at the Research Library for helping me fit in some archival research when I'm here. I couldn't be torn away from the archives. Thank you very, very much to Amelia Holmes, Jamie Gretz, Matt Cunard. I'm so excited to talk to you today and present the results of the research I've had the good luck to do here on Nantucket over the past several years. But there are a few more things I really need to say before diving in. So the first part of my talk here today has to be a Valentine to the Nantucket Historical Association, to this Whaling Museum, and to the community here on the island. My book came out last August, and I've had the good fortune to present it in a few different cities over the past several months. Next month, I'm taking this show to Paris. This is all very exciting. This is heady stuff for an academic. But there's something special about coming to Nantucket, something that makes this talk different from all the rest. First of all, it means everything to be by the sea. The vagaries of the academic job market have taken me to the University of Illinois, where I'm very happy. But you know the line from Moby Dick. Melville enumerates the marvels of Nantucket, and then he concludes his list of marvels and says, "These extravaganzas only show that Nantucket is no Illinois." Indeed. There are things I can understand only by being here. There are the indispensable archives, this museum, but most of all, the people here on the island, and especially here at the Nantucket Historical Association. I'm profoundly grateful, in particular, to Amelia Holmes, to Michael Harrison, to Ralph Henke, whom I wish very well in her retirement. They asked me important questions, and they made crucial suggestions. They welcomed me to the island time after time, even and especially when I didn't know what my research questions really were quite yet. I also want to say a special word of thanks to Nat Philbrick. Who amongst us isn't a reader and a fan? I'm deeply grateful to Nat for the companionship of his books, and for his in-person ideas, encouragement, and friendship. And I want to thank you all here for coming today. There is nothing like a Nantucket audience, and I'm so grateful for your time. So I want to spend the rest of my time today talking with you about energy. For a long time now, energy has been a topic of research for engineers, scientists, and policymakers. But energy has always been and should be a topic of concern for all of us. All of us. There are a lot of different forms of energy, and I'll talk in a little bit about renewable energy. But let's think for a moment just about all of the fossil fuels that you might have used today, just how much fossil fuels are written into your life. I'll speak for myself. The electricity I used on island today to plug in my laptop, to turn on my lights, it probably came from the grid on the mainland, across the water, under the water, through two submarine cables. These cables are routed underwater from Barnstable and Harwich, come ashore, I think, at the Candle Street substation. It's hard to give a pinpoint, precise estimate of the resources used in generating that electricity. It changes all the time. But the vast majority certainly comes from natural gas power production, and maybe 9 or 10% from wind and solar. Even in New England, the majority of electricity is produced by fossil fuels. So that's the tap I turned on when I used electricity today. I consumed a lot of fossil fuels yesterday in the gasoline that took me to the airport, the jet fuel that powered my flight to Boston, the fuel that powered the old Plymouth and Brockton bus line to Hyannis, the High Line ferry. I wear oil in the synthetic fabrics in my clothes and the plastic contact lenses in my eyes. I think about all the energy inputs that went into creating the blueberries in my morning yogurt. There are petroleum-based microplastics in my body, probably even in my lungs, probably yours too. We live in fossil fuels. They are the materials of our lives. I'm part of a growing community of scholars in the field of the energy humanities. We're historians, anthropologists, even scholars of literature and art. We're using our own methods of historical research and cultural analysis to understand what it means to live so profoundly and intimately in fossil fuels. What does it mean to have a life, a work, a means of transportation, a wardrobe, a medicine made up of fossil fuels? One of the consequences of massive fossil fuel consumption is climate change. And yes, my research is driven by the climate emergency. And yes, of course, when I think about all the work opportunities, the relationships, the experiences in my life that are made possible by fossil fuels, I'm on the one hand profoundly grateful for this life. It is my life. And at the same time, I feel implicated in climate change. This is really difficult stuff. And so my research proceeds from the simple recognition that our need for and our use of energy resources is one of the material facts of our lives. What do we do to understand this fact? This particular way of living intensively with fossil fuels, it didn't have to be this way. It doesn't always have to be this way. I hope it's not. But we can't understand the contingencies or the possibilities of energy future until we understand exactly what energy is and how it works in culture and life, as well as in science and policy. And so here I am, as a critic and a cultural historian, I'm trying to work how to understand how we got here. I researched the energy transitions of the 19th century in the United States, which I understand like this. Over the course of the 19th century, an energy regime predicated on a collection of organic fuel sources, like whale oil, tallow, wood, and the labor of human and animal bodies, began shifting to an energy regime predicated primarily on the extraction and consumption of fossil fuels, of mineral resources, organic to mineral. It's a very simplified story, but that's the rough shape of that energy transition. And energy transition is a tricky concept. It's one worth always questioning and asking about. But for now, I'd like for you just to imagine the energy transitions of the 19th century as this increase in fossil fuels and a decrease in various organic sources, the fossil fuel line going up the line graph and the organic energy sources going down. Today, I'll be focusing on that fuzzy, messy moment of crossing at mid-19th century, and then later on one of the descending lines in the organic to fossil energy transition, the US commercial whaling industry, of course. The main industry of the US commercial whaling industry was whale oil, which was used as a source of lighting and machine lubrication. Whaling was an oil industry. If you read a newspaper in 1845 in the US, a report about the oil market would probably be a report about the whaling industry. US commercial whaling expanded throughout the 19th century up until about the 1860s, when the first US oil boom in Pennsylvania flooded the oil market with a cheap substitute for whale oil, rock oil, or petroleum, rock oil. Now, no one on Nantucket in 1845 would have called the whaling industry an energy industry. Energy is a profound anachronism to describe the commodities that the US commercial whaling industry produced. Much better to call whale oil lighting oil or an illuminant and talk about it in relationship with other contemporary lighting oils on the market like tallow, kerosene, and so on. But if we think about whale oil only that way, I think we miss something important, which is that folks in the 19th century understood petroleum to be a viable replacement for whale oil, part of the same market and part of the same fuel infrastructure system. In 1861, Vanity Fair published a cartoon that dramatized the transition in the oil market from the point of view of the whales. This is the whales at their retirement party. The caption says, "This is the grand ball given by whales in honor of the discovery of the oil wells in Pennsylvania." How many of you have seen this? Yeah, so I've got to tell you, this brings down the house in Illinois. But I know a lot of you have seen this before, so I won't linger on it too long. But I do want to just call out, in case you can't read the small type, that some of these banners say things like, "Oil's well that ends well," and "We wail no more for our blubber." It's just terrible. But this cartoon helps us see how disparate illuminant sources become a single idea called energy. This cartoon dramatizes an emerging understanding of energy. Energy as a unified field of labor, production, and circulation, based not on the conditions of the resource's extraction, but on the consumption of its end product. Commercial whaling and commercial oil drilling demand wildly different forms of labor and infrastructure. Whaling means going out to sea. Oil drilling means going to Pennsylvania, sinking an oil well, drilling for oil. These are vastly different extractive practices, but they come together within an idea called a market, within an environmental imaginary, a myth called energy. And this wasn't the only way people in the mid-19th century understood petroleum as a successor to whale oil. They're all part of the emerging energy market. According to people who were there, the Pennsylvania oil fields were full of whales. Reporters covering the Pennsylvania oil boom in the 1860s wrote that oil wells spouted like whales coming up for air, and they said that oil shot through pipes from the well to the holding tank, quote, "with a sound like the blowing of a whale." According to an 1861 Kansas newspaper reporter, some oil field workers even imagined that underground oil reserves were fossilized whales. Some of the philosophers think this country was once an inland sea inhabited by the monsters of the deep, and that oil, as found, was the deathbed of an antediluvian whale. Oil is imperishable. Every vestige of the animal is gone but the grease. Perhaps oil field workers saw whales because so many of them had once worked in the whaling industry. And why wouldn't the whalemen go into petroleum? Oil was all oil, and whalemen were oilmen. It is no surprise that the oilmen saw whales in Pennsylvania. Such is the power of resource extraction to make one thing into another. The commercial whaling industry had made whales into oil, and so it took only a short intellectual leap to believe that oil might be made of whales. And as the petroleum fields grew, oilmen from the whaling industry sought better job opportunities in the new petroleum business. One observer, who was writing for the New York Tribune, observed the migration of workers from the whale fishery to the oil fields. "I find that New Bedford and Nantucket, heretofore oildom, has been unsuccessful for several years past and is coming here with its millions of money and its hordes of vessel officers, to harpoon the old mother of all whales, Earth, and draw her blubber by the force of steam, which must eventually injure whaling oildom very much. New England whalemen founded refineries, they built tank infrastructures, they opened hotels for oil field laborers. In 1861, a whale oil refiner named Charles Ellis and H. Rogers, son of a Fairhaven whaleman, built a refinery near Oil City, Pennsylvania. Within the first year of the refinery's operation, Rogers' quote, cruise to Pennsylvania had netted him as much as a half dozen whales. Rogers later became a director at John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Back in New Bedford, whaling magnate Abraham Howland converted a whale oil refinery over to kerosene and coal oil. New Bedford whaling captain and ship owner John Arnold Macomber built and operated oil storage tanks in Pennsylvania. And the Crape House Hotel for workers in Oil City, Pennsylvania, was founded by a New Bedford man, quote, who, like others from the same quondam oily city, now follow oil wherever they can smell it. These stories and the cartoon of the dancing whales help us see another way of understanding how energy becomes energy in the mid-19th century. So the word energy existed long before the 19th century, but it was primarily a word for poets. It was used to describe ephemeral spiritual forces. But by the end of the 19th century, through a root in thermodynamic science, the word energy came to mean what it does when I use it here today. One, the physical force that does work, and two, the fuel sources that make work possible. From the point of view of that Pennsylvania oil boom onward, the US whaling industry declined. The number of voyages decreased each year, and the number of barrels of whale oil continuously shrank. US commercial whaling was effectively dead by the 1920s. I want to clarify, though, that even though the US commercial whaling industry declined in the early 20th century, whaling in general has not ended. Through the end of the 19th century and through the mid-20th century, global whaling actually accelerated as new technologies made it possible to slaughter whales on even larger scales. As whale oil fell out of use for lighting purposes, it gained popularity as an animal fat in margarine, soap, and other products produced mainly by the British and Norwegian whaling fleets. There's no real answer as to why the US whaling industry didn't expand through the 19th century the way that others did. I would hypothesize it has something to do with the fact that we had so much animal protein available in the western part of the United States. And whaling, it must be said, continues as a vital and ecologically sustainable form of subsistence and cultural practice among many different indigenous nations, including the Inupiat, the Makah, the Yupik, and the Chukchi. So when I talk about US commercial whaling here today, I'm talking about a very specific form of the industry, the oil industry, the proto-energy industry. That's what declined and died in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. My research asks, where did the whaling industry go when it died? So I argue that the US whaling industry remained a feature of nationwide popular culture in ways that did not abate during the industry's obsolescence. Energy regimes have a long cultural afterlife. So in my recent book, is it ghost to put my book cover on the screen? I don't know, but there it is. In my recent book, I argue that whaling profoundly shaped US culture, even and especially as the industry declined and the US rapidly adopted fossil fuels. Whaling culture mediated the organic to fossil energy transition of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Whaling culture became a site from which to take a compass reading of energy and modernity. The whaling industry was the subject of a wide and diverse body of cultural production, novels, nonfiction narratives, traveling exhibitions, museums, public art. I could spend all day talking about the different ways and the different surprising places where whaling culture showed up. These texts, artifacts, and bodies told stories about the obsolescing whale industry, but they also told stories about fossil fuel modernity and the world to come. So, I'm about halfway through my talk, and I promise I'm going to get to quaintness. I want to spend the rest of my time talking about Nantucket. In my book, I write about the enduring power of whaling culture in a lot of different places, in Chicago, in New Bedford, in literature, art, film, pop culture, but today, I want to talk about the development of the tourist industry on Nantucket in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. I want to think through the history of how this powerful, wealthy industrial port experienced profound deindustrialization and impoverishment, and then transformed itself into the most fabulous resort on the East Coast. In the narrative I just offered you of energy transition in the 19th century, I talked about how whaling started declining in the 1860s with petroleum. This is true of the national whaling industry as a whole, but the story of energy transition in Nantucket begins a little bit earlier than that. The whaling industry started leaving Nantucket earlier than it left New Bedford and other ports ashore. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, Nantucket made its wealth supplying whale oil to the British markets. Whaling ships, ship owners, refiners, and laborers started moving from Nantucket to New Bedford as the United States market, along with the country itself, expanded. Where am I? Oh yeah, it was easier at that point to ship whale oil overland by train straight from New Bedford. The decline of whaling was accelerated by the Great Fire of 1846 on Nantucket, which decimated whaling infrastructure and the local economy as a whole. Starting in the 1840s, the whaling industry slowly left the island along with a lot of the island's population. But between that grim mid-19th century moment and the turn of the 20th century, in less than 50 years, Nantucket became the seaside tourist retreat par excellence, a quaint place suited for fashionable, conspicuous vacationing and a place which seemed to have escaped the sights and sounds of fossil modernity. A lot of the research I've done on Nantucket is in the history of its early tourist industry in the mid and late 19th century. The NHA Research Library has an astonishingly broad collection of material from this period. I looked through railroad and steamship maps and timetables, hotel brochures and menus, tour guides, local histories, postcards, tourist narratives. The research library holds this really rich collection, and I will tell you that I just did not find there what I expected to find. I was constantly surprised by what was in this really multifarious collection of tourist literature and art. So in the remainder of this talk, I want to talk through this one pretty obvious opinion about the way that Nantucket tourists saw the island in the late 19th century. And I don't know if people still use this word. I would love to know what you think. But what they thought is that Nantucket was so quaint. This opinion might seem so obvious as to be beyond mentioning, but I argue that the development of this tourist truth on Nantucket gives us a window into the cultural effects of 19th century energy transition. Most of what folks, like historians like me, have written about energy history and energy transition is about the effect of new fossil fuel technologies on work. Steam-powered machinery, revolutionizing factories, agricultural work, seafaring, electricity creating so-called labor-saving devices. But I think that looking at the history of leisure in energy transition is just as important. And Nantucket became a place for a very particular kind of leisure. How Americans learned to relax and travel in the early era of fossil-fueled modernity tells us a lot about how life and work were changed by coal and oil. Nantucket tourism was a handshake between the quaint old world of whale oil and the strange new world of fossil-fueled modernity. So for obvious reasons, Nantucket was slow to adopt some fossil-fueled infrastructure, loath to give up the whale oil technologies that were the pride and wealth of the island. One tourist guidebook to the island, which I'll quote a few times during this talk, reports this. Nantucket, which had for 2 centuries given light to the world, at last accepted herself the inevitable, and in 1854, gas was lighted for the first time in the town. The inevitable was this: fossil fuels were remaking the Northeast. But the island's tourist industry and its post-whaling prosperity were made possible at every level by coal, petroleum, and natural gas. Late 19th century Nantucket tourism was a phenomenon of fossil fuel modernity. Between 1865 and 1890, the number of railroad miles in the United States increased fourfold. That's fourfold in less than 30 years. And some of those fossil-fueled trains and steamships brought tourists to Nantucket. New railroads increased access to new coastal resorts, but they did much more than that. The railroads and steamship lines did much more than simply provide access. Rail and steam lines also financed the construction of hotels at new destinations. And even more intriguingly to an English professor, the railroads produced a huge body of tourist literature in different genres, not just your kind of guidebook with listings, but even fictional novels that were meant to promote Nantucket tourism and New England tourism. Railroad tourist literature prescribed specific New England tourist experiences, routing vacationers through transportation logistics, hotel etiquette, and even choreographing their emotions and opinions. One of my favorite finds in the NHA archives was this little ticket envelope from the Fall River Steamship Line, probably from the 1880s. It's this beautiful little printed thing, and it tells us a little bit about what it was like to experience the relatively new technology of tourist steamships. This little envelope prepares passengers for their experience on board and teaches them how to be travelers. A portrait of a steamer of the Fall River Line near the shore at, quote, the dawn of day on Narragansett Bay. This is what covers the front of the envelope, and it hints at the tranquility of a summer vacation. But the back of the envelope is crammed with all of the intricate information a tourist needed to get there. The triangular envelope flap This triangular envelope flap is printed with a long list of instructions for passengers, inciting them to please remember, and I'll name just a few of these. That tickets should be removed from envelope before it's handed to collector at the gangway. Do not leave personal effects in stateroom or berth. Look around carefully to see if you have left anything. Still good advice. Seats in parlor cars from Fall River may be secured at purser's office. Eastbound passengers are called 40 minutes previous to departure of the first Boston Express train unless contrary notice is given at purser's office. The electric lights in staterooms are turned on and off, the same as gas. To call a servant, press the electric button a second. There's much more. The back of this envelope represents the two-part infrastructural system of steamship and railroad that brings passengers to fashionable watering places. These commands are printed discreetly on the inside of the envelope flap, perhaps so as not to embarrass a novice passenger who's learning the ropes. Teaching passengers how to behave was not a social nicety. Passenger travel on the steamships of New England was tightly choreographed so that passengers could slot themselves into the matrix of steamship to railroad connection that made systems like the Fall River Line so convenient. These instructions tell passengers how to move through the connection from the moment that they present the ticket for boarding until the moment they leave their staterooms. The envelope tells them how to make the connection from steamship to railroad even more efficient. As the 19th century ends, the tourist guides published by the railroads and steam lines devote less and less space to these kinds of instructions, perhaps because passengers are getting the hang of it. So, the experience of getting to Nantucket was a thoroughly modern experience, underwritten by fossil fuels in every way. When I think about passengers confronting this barrage of instructions, I'm reminded of Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times, going through the gears of the machine. This is a very modern experience. And these little pieces of early fossil modernity give us a glimpse of what it was like to learn these systems for the first time, to encounter world-shaking technology change in everyday life. I imagine it was exhilarating and exhausting to learn to travel in a brand new way. This little ticket envelope makes me curious and sympathetic for folks in the late 19th century who were buffeted and astonished by the changing world around them, doing their best to learn the ropes. And one of the reasons they came to Nantucket was to escape precisely these new fossil modern conditions, to find a break from modernity in a place that seemed to offer a glimpse into the past. Which brings me to quaintness. Philosophers since Aristotle have taken up questions of aesthetics and beauty, offering us definitions of the beautiful, the sublime, the picturesque, telling us why these things are important to think about. I'd argue that it's important to continue the rigorous study of aesthetics, paying attention to, let's call them minor aesthetic categories that better reflect the aesthetic diversity of everyday life in the modern world. Quaintness is a minor aesthetic category that I find worthy of attention. And while a lot of places in the world might be understood as quaint, there's something particular about Nantucket's quaintness. Nantucket quaintness tourism was both a product of and a reaction to energy transition in the 19th century. Modern fossil-fueled transportation infrastructure made it possible to visit Nantucket. Quaintness and the signs of the old whaling industry made Nantucket attractive. The loss of the whaling industry and the poverty of Nantucket in the mid-19th century was actually the basis for Nantucket's attraction, the source of its strange charm for tourists. Mid-19th century Nantucket was depopulated and run down, its oil warehouses and candle factories standing empty on decaying wharves, and its inhabitants were growing poor. Nantucket in the mid-19th century was a post-industrial port whose economic decline had been brought on by the decline of whaling, the devastating 1846 fire, and the loss of so many residents to jobs and lives on the mainland. The quietude left in the wake of industry, the weathering, rust, and ill repair that characterize a place in decline. Residents used words for these conditions like decline, crisis, trouble. Tourists use the word quaint. As you might imagine, there's a very strong difference between accounts of the island written by residents around this time and those written by outsiders. For residents, the quietude of the island was a source of sadness. This is a long quote, but I think it's worthwhile. I think it's a very representative account, written by Alexander Starbuck, published in 1882 in one of these tourist guides to Nantucket, Godfrey's guide. At home, when peace reigned, the people were all busy, happy, and prosperous. The warehouses were crowded with goods, and the streets thronged with teams and foot passengers. At the wharves lay a large fleet of vessels taking in or discharging cargoes or refitting for new voyages. The cheery din of the cooper's hammers and the ring of the blacksmith's anvils resounded on all sides. The sail lofts, the shops of the riggers, and the walks of the rope makers were occupied by the multitudes that the demands of shipping gave employment to. In 1,000 ways, the activities of a prosperous business showed themselves. But all this is now changed. The ships long ago sailed on their last voyages from Nantucket. Not an ocean on the face of the globe, but holds in its embrace the shattered remains of a portion of her fleet, while the surviving portion hails from other ports. The tools of the mechanic are silent. The bustle of traffic no longer crowds the streets. The wharves are deserted, decaying, or decayed, and the warehouses have long been vacant and closed. To a native of Nantucket, it is a sad sight to thus see Ichabod written on her desolate places, to look upon the ruined wharves and storehouses, and to see even the toilers of the sea themselves look old and weather-beaten, to see them rapidly nearing that port in which their anchor will be cast, never to be weighed again. So the passage of the whaling business from Nantucket is rendered through this account as the disappearance of sights and sounds. Tools are silent, traffic no longer crowds, wharves are deserted, warehouses are vacant, and even the old whalemen are attenuated and lifeless. Outsiders notice the same thing. They notice this quietude, but they found the perceptible absence of bygone industry quaint, evidence of an old-fashioned something that was picturesque and even pleasantly Gothic. One 1868 account from Lippincott's magazine compares Nantucket's deathly appearance to that of quaint European towns. Nantucket now has a body-of-death appearance such as few New England towns possess. The houses stand around in faded gentility style. The inhabitants have a dreamy look as though they live in the memories of the past. For tourist A. Judd Northrop, whose account of a summer spent on Nantucket, actually out in Sconset, helped popularize the rustic cottage vacations on the island. And for him, the memory of whaling haunts the island like a friendly ghost. The wharves are ample to receive the oily freights of many whalers, as in the good old days, if only their ghosts would rehabilitate themselves in oaken hulls and spread again the many-sheeted canvas, but they are all nearly vacant now. Northrop describes the same empty wharves as Starbuck, but he's less somber. Nantucket was just haunted enough to be fascinating to tourists. Here's another example from the guidebook written by Edward Godfrey. Newspaper correspondents, and in fact visitors generally, describe the town as a quaint old place. The town is old as old things go in this country, and there's a very strong smack of quaintness about those houses, which Burdett so happily describes as being shingled, shangled, shongled, and shungled. So the wordplay is a little cute, it's a little quaint. It's certainly not the melancholy reflection of loss that we saw in the earlier description. By the end of the 19th century, quaint Nantucket was already a well-worn cliche. Visitors knew it, and even by then they were a little embarrassed to call Nantucket quaint. A letter from a visitor was reprinted as a testimonial for the Seacliff Hotel. It was like on the Seacliff Hotel brochure, and it laments the overuse of the term. Well, here I am, safe and sound, in quaint old Nantucket. It is too bad that that adjective quaint has been so promiscuously used, for I am very sure the copyright of it should belong solely to Nantucket. So I confess, and you can probably tell this in the way that I'm talking about this, I find something a little mean and a little bit insensitive about some of this quaintness discourse in the late 19th century. It's disturbing for wealthy out-of-towners to find Nantucket's impoverishment so cute. I felt ambivalent when I found this small paper hand-bound book called Nantucket Characters. It was produced for the tourist trade in the late 19th century by the fairly well-known photographer Henry Sherman Wire. It offers portraits of Nantucket's quaint inhabitants. On the one hand, these photographs are gorgeous. They give a tantalizing glimpse of life on Nantucket in the late 19th century. On the other hand, these photos objectify and even poke a little bit of fun at impoverished Nantucketers. The famous town crier of Nantucket has pride of place in the book's first portrait. In the era of newspapers and telegrams, visitors to Nantucket were charmed by the endurance of the old technology for distributing the news. A town crier who shouted the news to passersby. He's framed by an open door of a shingled building. This town crier in his rumpled suit and misshapen hat faces the camera with a bundle of papers in one arm and the famous fish horn that he uses to augment his voice in the other. The image is captioned with a representative announcement. Now there's been a fearful storm out west, a ripping fire in New York, horrible murder in Boston, auction this morning, corned beef, and a grand ball this evening at the rink, and that's the news of today. This is the caption, and I think it makes him seem a little bit serious, maybe over-serious, a little bit silly, especially with a very serious expression on this man's face. The portrait is at the same time tender and condescending. Another portrait depicts the captain and his pet. Wire's photograph shows an old man in a baggy suit and hat standing next to a ship's figurehead. A ship's nameplate, Shanunga, maybe you can tell me how to pronounce that. It hangs above the barn door. The captain and his maritime appurtenances are orphaned from their ship. His disheveled suit and the humble, grassy yard suggest faded glory. Once again, I see both appreciation and condescension in this portrait. Nantucket Characters crystallizes the visual style of quaintness and gives us a glimpse of the quaint characters that tourists sought and saw when they were on the island. But lest I fall into a state of disapproval or depression about quaintness, I want to note the Nantucketers were active agents in marketing and even creating the conditions of their own quaintness once they saw that it was what tourists wanted. The brilliant historian Donna Brown has written about this, and she found that Nantucketers actively cultivated the look of quaintness on the island, and they even fabricated artifacts to sell to tourists to capitalize on the craze for quaintness. Tourism in the late 19th century did a lot for this island. It brought employment, life, and new people. Not everyone was sad about the way that the decline of whaling had made the island quaint. There's this amazing tourist guide here in the research library that's written in the form of this fictional novel, published by a railroad company. Who knew that railroad companies were fictional authors? Its protagonist is a tourist to Nantucket, and he's taken with the decaying whaling infrastructure. He says this, "Let the old ships rot where they're stranded. Let the swift and keen harpoon rust upon its hooks. 'Tis bric-a-brac now, and I would like to have it for my library. There are other days for old Nantuck. When the stumpy mariner shouts, "There she blows," be sure he has heard the steamer's whistle, and more tourists are coming, and times will be flush again. This protagonist is an outsider without the experience of or empathy for the hardships that befell earlier generations. But he's right that the end of whaling paved the way for the coming of tourism. As I said before, there couldn't have been fossil modern tourism and prosperity on Nantucket without the whaling industry's decline. Late 19th century quaintness tourism is a form of culture made by energy transition. So I'm coming to the end here. The story that I tell about the ongoing cultural influence of the whaling industry on the ascendant fossil fuel energy regime, it's a story about historical change in the 19th century. It's a story about the past. But I think that there are lessons here for the present. We're contemplating energy transition here and now in our climate-changed world. We have to. But what my research has taught me is that the stories of new energy regimes are told with the materials of old energy regimes. New innovative technologies are built on the bones of obsolescence. If nothing else, the history of whaling's cultural afterlife in fossil modernity reveals this, that old ways of being never disappear. If we want to usher in a new sustainable energy future, if we want to mitigate fossil-fueled climate change, what shall we do with our fossil-fueled world, with the fossil-fueled culture that we've built? If you'll permit me, I'll end today with an invitation and a request. You are Nantucketers who live with and in the island's seasonal rhythms, within its changing climate, within a landscape shaped for better and for worse by tourism. I really want to know how these rhythms affect you in the day-to-day life of your community. Tell me what you think about all this. I'm a scholar, I need to learn. More than anything else, I'm a student. I also want to know about your energy culture here on Nantucket right now. It's fair to say that fossil fuels still power so much of what happens here on the island as everywhere. I have been following from afar the construction and controversies over offshore wind. I want to continue learning about energy history and contemporary energy culture in Nantucket. So I'll be here on the island for a few days. And if you have an energy story, if there's something you want me to know about Nantucket's energy culture in the past or present, I'd love to hear from you and have a conversation. I would be very profoundly grateful for any and all experiences. My email address is right up here. So please do be in touch. And for now, thank you so much for coming tonight. I've loved talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for your presentation today. And I loved seeing all of the NHA archival material and collection objects incorporated in your research there. So we have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you.
Yes. Well, this is a little edgy question, but you were talking about what the tourists thought about the people that they saw here, but I wonder what the people thought of themselves. Because when I see those pictures, what draws me in is pride, resilience, resourcefulness, and connection.
Yeah.
So that's what draws me to quaintness in a positive way.
Yeah. I think that's a brilliant question. I love the idea that you're seeing pride and resilience in those images. I am too, and I'm also seeing pride and resilience in the stories of Nantucketers who would take something brand new and kind of distress it a little bit to make it look quaint and sell it to people for a high markup. I think that's a brilliant strategy of resilience. People on this island made a very, very conscious decision to embrace tourism as a new form of economy. And I think that is absolutely a fact. I appreciate this question, and I don't think it's edgy at all, and I think it's important. And as you can tell here, I'm not willing to come down on one side and say, quaintness good or bad, you know? I think that it is both. It's really, really complicated, and I think that it's hard to get at what a lot of folks on the island thought of this emerging form of tourism and this kind of emerging aesthetic as being applied to themselves, just because of the way that the archives are configured. I was here to look at what the tourists thought and what they saw. But I do know that a lot of people saw opportunity in tourism, survival, survivance, and I know that is true. And I'm still looking for other stories. I would love to tell the other side of this transition from the point of view of Nantucketers, and I really appreciate that question. If you have an idea, if anyone has idea, please let me know. Yes.
I've always been interested in that, the other icon of quaintness, which is the old mill.
Yes.
Now, the old mill is part of the story as you arc it,
Yeah.
from the wind energy into
Yeah.
electricity.
Yeah.
And there are many images of the mill in that late 19th century,
Yeah.
which show it featured still, quiet, no silent. You get the sense of silence. The post fencing around it is
Yeah.
broken, and it's held up against a. Because they were really interested in tonalism in the 1890s, it's held up against a sky background that's can be radiant with a sunset, not a sunrise, but a sunset, and it's just always, it's very and the tone is melancholy. They're and yet it's used as that icon of quaintness to celebrate the past culture. And anyway, it's part of your story.
Yeah.
And the Nantucketers take these, and the old mill basically was auctioned off in the middle of Main Street, and it was one of the first properties of the Historical Association. So I think it's as important as the harbor scene, and it's put on the one of the high points of the island.
Yeah.
The harbor being the low point, the mill being the high point. And yet, that there were 7 mills, and they bombed them or exploded them. They tore them down. So it wasn't that it was left just because it was the last man standing. It was left and used as this new kind of melancholy symbol. And then it becomes the representative of the loss of the mechanical culture.
Yeah, yeah. No, I really appreciate that question. When I was writing this book, I kind of ignored the old mill. When I came to the island, I would take a walk up to the old mill every time I was here, take a look at it. But my eye was on the water. And I think you're absolutely right. And that's one of the things I'm researching today. I just put in a big request because I have ignored this. And I've got to tell you, in a separate project, I'm writing an essay right now about Thoreau's Cape Cod, his 1865 narrative of his walk all along the backside of the Cape. And I felt chastened by Thoreau as well. Thoreau was saying, pay attention to the mills. He was talking about the mills as the most prominent features of the landscape on the Cape in the mid-19th century, and of course they were. They were huge pieces of vital infrastructure, and that's something that I really would like to work on now, and I appreciate the way that you're putting the mill into this kind of aesthetic context, the way that it's represented against the sunset with that melancholy. I think that's a really, really thoughtful way of thinking about the aestheticization of decline and melancholy. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks. Appreciate all these questions. Like what do Nantucketers think about quaintness is a good one too.
My question is about how you think Nantucket really won out in and being so successful in the tourism industry after whaling, and how you said, I think at the beginning of the talk, Nantucket's kind of maybe #1 tourist destination on the East Coast or something, something like that, and how much of that has to do with so much like infrastructure and wealth already being there because of the whaling industry. Like obviously there's other factors like geographic factors,
Yeah.
like the beaches and all of that, but that's not like the only reason. How much has to do with like all of the wealth already established there and all of the you know, the capital of the whaling industry, of the energy, you know, how energy was you know, the energy regime of the time. It was the capital of that. Like how much of that kind of helped Nantucket like become the tourist industry, tourist destination? You know, was that like the deciding factor? Why didn't the vineyard end up like that, or another beach community on the East Coast? And also like, when did that happen? Like, did it happen right after? I mean, I know it didn't happen right after the decline of whaling, but when did it really like establish itself? And you know, if you were to kind of chart out like almost how Nantucket was as like a tourist destination, when did it, you know, how did it go from the end of the whaling industry to like, you know, now it's just getting more and more insane in terms of tourism every year. If you look at the housing prices and all of that. I know that's a long time, but
No, I really appreciate that question. You're asking a lot of questions that I don't have good or concise answers to. I will say that the history of the development of tourism on Nantucket is much longer than what I portrayed here and stretches back even earlier than I said. For example, in the 1830s and 40s, like Sconset especially was already a place that people thought was a great place to go take a kind of healthful, relaxing, restful vacation. It was becoming fashionable in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Europe, and to some extent here as well, for folks to seek out salt water for bathing and as a kind of curative, restful place. And I think what changed in the period that I'm talking about here is the scale of tourism, just a huge ramp up in like the numbers of people. And you're also asking another really, really interesting question about wealth. How much of Nantucket's sort of future success from the point of view of the 19th century might have been built on the wealth that was already here on the island from the whaling industry. And I think that's a really good question, and I would like to have the tools to follow the money precisely on that, to tell a really precise story. I think there's a very good story to be told there. And I will say that there is a lot of continuity between the wealth made in the whaling industry here and other places in the US and the wealth that kind of compounded and grew during the Gilded Age. You know, I think about folks like Hetty Green, the Witch of Wall Street, who invested her family's whaling wealth to great success. And one of her descendants was Colonel Edmund Green, who then worked in the Texas oil industry among a lot of other places, and ended up kind of looking back to his family's own heritage and his region's own heritage and help set up new tourist infrastructure around whaling heritage in New Bedford, actually in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. And so there is a kind of point of continuity. And like I said, there was a lot of people who went from the whaling industry to the oil industry, continued to make a bunch of money there, and brought it back to coastal ports where they and their families were from. But the evidence I have, people like H.H. Rogers, who went on to be a major figure in Standard Oil, but a lot of the evidence I have is anecdotal. You know, it's hard to find. There isn't an envelope here or in New Bedford or in Providence or Mystic that says, you know, people who took their whaling money and made even more money with fossil fuels. But I do find little like anecdotal bits and pieces that make it hard for me to answer your question, but that I think speak to the promise in that kind of inquiry. You want to write the book? I want to read it. So it's a great idea. Yeah, there are two questions back here.
I'm holding the microphone at the moment, so I'll just jump in quickly to the gentleman's question. There is definitely a book that needs to be written about the history of wealth and Nantucket.
Yes.
How wealthy did whaling actually make the island?
Yeah.
What is that in comparison with other industrial centers, both in the colonial period and in the early republic? There is a tendency to look back and exaggerate what the scope of that was, and to treat it without looking in comparison to other places in the U.S. You know, there's an article that appeared in New Bedford in the 1860s that declared New Bedford to be the wealthiest place in the United States.
Yeah.
That was not true at the time. You know, if you looked per capita, it was Mobile, Alabama, because of slavery and what that brought to the economy there. That article has been translated a number of times to, or corrupted rather, to call Nantucket the wealthiest place in the world, which it never was. But one of the things that a study of wealth would want to get at is the really interesting question of the wealth that was generated here by whaling. Most of it left. It is elsewhere. And in part of a national trend, it appears in other industries and other things, and that wealth now exists in other forms and still exists, but it doesn't exist here. And the wealth that has now come as second home ownership and part of tourism and the sort of modern phase of tourism is a different wealth, generally generated in other places and in other ways. And it would be phenomenal to have a literature on that, which is currently absolutely lacking.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that, like, I don't want to play too fast and loose with this term, but it is true of a lot of extractive industries that wealth is extracted in one place and moves somewhere else. It doesn't always kind of enrich the place from which it is extracted. I think my favorite book about that right now is a graphic memoir, sort of written in the form of comic art by an artist named Kate Beaton, who is from Newfoundland, from a kind of formerly rich fishing community, and she spent 2 years in the Alberta tar sands working to pay off her college debt. And she writes about how it might have been that she could have gotten a fishing job 50 years ago in her hometown, but now everyone in her town was heading out west to work in the Alberta oil fields. And I think it traces the kind of migration of both labor and wealth in very 21st century extractive industries. So yeah, I'm with Mike. Someone write that book. Sounds great. Bring me back and I'll try.
Just one comment about the wealth and quaintness. What comes to my mind immediately is the architecture. And you know, the wealth is exhibited in the architecture, which has contributed to the quaintness.
That we are removing everything that was quaint. Or not everything, but many things that are, you know, and I think this idea of what was, you know, the broken back, salt box, sagging roof line, the lichen-covered shingles that you have on the slide there. I don't think people come to Nantucket now, and it's interesting because you show the pictures. Sorry. And I think there is like a reverence for the old salt archetype.
Yeah, that's right.
And that is something I thought about a lot.
Yeah.
Because as those people are displaced, what is left? So the idea that people would be drawn to a place because they wanted to see it and observe it and fit into it, and I don't think that's the island that we're necessarily living on now. I'm Mary, by the way. We'll talk more tomorrow. But
Thanks for coming.
I don't know. There's not really an answer to that, but it's interesting just to think about, you know, the ways in which people recreate, and how does that change, and how do you come to a place and then you want to like exert your control over a place, and then does that place change, and all that. So
That's, I really appreciate those two beautiful insights. You know, when I was researching this, I kept seeing this word in the archives, and I expected to, quaint. It's like, more. Tell me more. Tell me what I don't already know about Nantucket. And then finally I was like, what is this? What is this quaintness? And I had to think about, well, where do I actually pin it down? Where did folks in the 19th century pin it down? And architecture was definitely one place. That quote, the shingle, shingle, shungle, shungle, that was from an entry, a kind of like part of the tourist guide, under the heading architecture. That was one place to see quaintness. Characters, that's a name people used for people. They called them characters. Characters was another place where you saw quaintness on Nantucket. There was a kind of mood and atmosphere, a kind of vibe that was quaint, but then there were also these very specific places to look in the 19th century for quaintness, and architecture was definitely one of them, and characters was one of the others.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm going back to the old mill
Yeah, thank you.
because it is still an amazing part of our community. And I specifically want to, at the very beginning of the pandemic, the NHA put up a giant sign. I wish I could remember the exact words, but I don't know if you're aware. They put it at the part of the mill that faced the hospital, and it was basically thanking the first responders. And I don't remember the phrase itself, but it was this giant. And it's sometimes the way we have often on the some of the lighthouses, you'll have a big flag put up. It's huge, but it was the community, and everybody drove by there. You were also going to the hospital because you were getting tested, but it was very much, and then you weren't interacting with people, but here was a very huge symbol during that time. And we were extremely close in terms of community then. We were much more isolated during that period. So that's still an incredibly important part here.
Thank you so much for telling me that. If you or anyone has a picture of that.
I have a picture. I will send.
Oh, that's
I
great.
drove up the hill, and I'm also on the board of the NHA, and I had no idea they were doing this.
Yeah.
And I went up the hill, and I went, oh my God.
Yeah, wow. I also look, I subscribe to the Inquirer and Mirror like any good Nantucket curious person, so I'll look there too, but I appreciate any pictures of that. Yeah, the last time I was on the island was January 2020. I had this glorious research trip, and I told everyone, I'll see you back here in a few months. I can't wait to follow up. I've got so many loose ends, and this is the first time I'm back.
All right. Thank you so much, Jamie, for traveling to the island to share your research with us. She'll be on island for a couple more days, and after this talk, please continue to chat with her. I'm sure she'll take a few more questions and sign a book. So in exactly a week from today, we have our next lecture here at the Whaling Museum. A professor from the University of Texas will be talking about the history behind the fascination around sharks and how Nantucket played a role in that. So please join us again at the museum in exactly a week. All right, thank you so much for coming out, and thank you to our members who make these free public programs possible. And one more round of applause for Jamie Jones.